Okay. Shalom, Shavua Tov to everyone. Good week. The shiur today is not, almost not a shiur about a person, it's a shiur about a universe, which is called the Chida, Rabbi Yosef, Chaim, Azulai. This shiur, as the rest of the series, is dedicated in memory Leilui Nishmat of Rafael Moshe ben Eliyahu Zichrono Livracha. So I know that I promised in the end of the last week that the shiur today would be, we would return to Lithuania about a shiur about the Litvish Rabbi. But when I made the calculation of the years, I saw that the next Rabbi I want to speak about, I'm trying to speak in the order of their birth. And I saw that the next Rabbi should be really Rabbi Yosef Chaim David Azulai, and his mother was Ashkenazic. So, I took the license. He's not Lithuanian in any he never set foot on Lithuania. Although nowadays you have people here in Israel claiming that they are Litvish rabbis who I think also never set foot in Lithuania. Anyhow, the Chida, Rabbi Yosef Chaim David Azulai, is being born in 1724 in Yerushalayim. Now, I want to give a few minutes of background about Yerushalayim in the first half of the 18th century. Yerushalayim in the first half of the 18th century is, as many times happen, the direct consequence of what happened in the last half of the 16th century. What did happen, of the 17th century? What did happen in the last half of the 17th century? Well, we all know what happened was Shabtai Tzvi. And after Shabtai Tzvi, there were some, both Ashkenazic and Sephardic movements, which to a certain degree were continuation of the false messianic movement of Shabtai Tzvi. I mean, obviously, they didn't see themselves as false. But they were, so now again, it's very difficult to point out to what exact measure were they a continuation. Usually they would deny, and other people would accuse them of being continuation. The specific man that I'm speaking about is called Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, and some of you may be familiar with the shul in the old city of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid. He is not to be confused. We are speaking about a figure from the 17th century. He is not to be confused with the 30th century rabbi in Ashkenaz, who was also called Rabbi Yehuda Hasid and was from a completely different, as you can understand, a completely different era and a completely different person. Now, this Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, that we are not going to dedicate a shiur for, but he led one of the biggest movement of Aliyah. So there were about 1,000 people that he led to Yerushalayim. Again, to what extent was he continuing Shabtai Tzvi? That's a question that is beyond my era of expertise. The expert says that he was very heavily influenced by Sabtianism. So he's arriving to Yerushalayim with 1,000 Ashkenazic Jews. Yerushalayim at the time is mostly Sephardic and hardly have 1,000 Jews living, as it were. So we are speaking about doubling the Jewish population of Yerushalayim without any sustainable income source. We can all understand how it's going to end up. It ends up with, well, Rabbi Yehuda Hasid himself died immediately after coming to Yerushalayim, so they were penniless and leaderless, and I apologize, but also mainly clueless. Mm-hmm. So they are standing there, and basically what they say is, can you spare us some tzedakah? And that is not going to work for a long time if you are now half of the population. And no political messaging is intended, but if you are half of the population, you need to begin to work. And they were not really able to do so. And the end result was that the Turks, right, we are speaking about the Ottomans, are ruling the land, and the Ashkenazi Jews were taking loans, and there was no way they are going to be able to pay them back. So the Ottomans confiscated the court in which the large Ashkenazi shul was being built. So that was confiscated, which was a big trauma, because usually you do not confiscate religious buildings, but there was just nothing else to take. So they took the court and they expelled all the Ashkenazi Jews. And more than that, they decreed, the Turks, that every Ashkenazi Jews coming from now on to Yerushalayim should first pay the standing debt of the Ashkenazi war Jewry, I guess. That's the way that they saw it. So from there on, Ashkenazi Jews coming into Yerushalayim would obviously dress up as Sephardic. And that's why we are, nowadays, more than 200 years later, we have some interesting Yerushalayim Jerusalem Hasiduyot that dress up like the Sephardic of 200 years ago. That's the Toldot Aaron and others. So that's just an interesting quirk of history. Anyhow, so we can understand that in the first half of the 18th century, that is the time area in which we speak, there is no organized Ashkenazi community in Yerushalayim, because it was completely shattered by the unfortunate aliyah of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. Now, the Chida, our hero of today, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, is born. His father is a Sephardic, coming from a very important and respectful Sephardic dynasty of rabbis and mainly Mekubalim. About 4 generations before that, about 4 generations, its father was Rabbi Abraham Azulai, which maybe mean not too much to you, but to the Mekubalim it meant very much. And he was a very respectful. His origin was from Castilla, so they traced themselves back to real Spain. So the origin was from Castilla, and they came to Morocco, and there was this Mekubal Rabbi Avraham Azulai, and now Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai is being born to that family, while the mother, as I said earlier, was Ashkenazic. Now, we don't have too much information about her. She died when young Chaim Yosef was very young, but later, when his journeys would take him to Europe, about which we would speak in Mirze Hashem, he was able to ascertain that his mother came also from a very respected rabbinic family, the family of Rabbi Yoshua Falk, known as the Sma, the Sefer Meir Atenaim. He was a very important Ashkenazic posek. We are not sure, but it seems that she was part of the Aliyah of Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, obviously as a very young girl, or maybe she was born in Yerushalayim to parents that came with Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid. So that is the family background of the Chida. We have a very interesting story, not very important to the life of the Chida, but I found it very cute, so I brought it inside the source sheet. You can see it in source Aleph. And that is from Avraham Kלפון, who was a younger friend or a student of the Chida. And that is the story that he tells. מעשה הרב הגדול המופלא, מופת הדור, והדרו, כבוד מורנו. So this is the story of the great rabbi, the wonderful, the one in the generation, the joy of the generation. Our teacher, Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, zichro livracha lechaye haolam haba, his memory is blessed, and his zchut, his merit should defend us, amen כן יהי רצון. הוא נולד בארץ ישראל, תבנה ותכונן במהרה בימינו. So he was born in Yerushalayim. Not too many rabbis that we spoke about were born in Yerushalayim. That's by itself, I think, is special. Now, the year is Taf Pei Dalet, that is for us 1724, and he was 7 months when he was born. That means that the pregnancy was only 7 months. Even nowadays, being born in 7 months, Baruch Hashem, most of the time they would be able to save you, but it's not a simple matter. And back then, it was almost certain death verdict. So he was born after a 7-month pregnancy, ונולד כמת. They saw him as a stillborn. וחשבו עליו אוהביו שמת, his family thought that he died in birth, ועזבו אותו והניחו אותו בקרקע. They just left him lying there. I guess they were treating the mother, and no one was taking care of the young baby because obviously he's dead. ונכנסה עליו זקנתו, his grandmother came in, and while everyone was attending the mother, she was looking at the baby, וידעה שעדיין יש בו הנפש. She knew, she saw, she felt, she sensed. Who knows what senses grandmothers have, right? So she was sensing that the baby has a nefesh, has a soul, he is a living, his heart is beaming. ולקחה אותו, she took him from the ground, וקרחה אותו בצמר גפן, she took wool, I guess, and put all around him, ונתחמם, she was very cold. Again, a baby that is born in a very young age, premature, is not able to warm himself. So maybe that's why they thought that he died, and they didn't try to take care of him. וחיה, and she was able to bring him back to life, ונתגדל לשם ולתפארת. And he was raised, obviously, to fame and to glory. So this Jewish grandmother, unknown but of that, was really the vehicle of life for one of the great rabbis of the last 200 years. And as a matter of fact, he wrote many, many, many books. We'll speak about that as we would continue. But some of his books were dedicated to his grandmother because he knew that she, in a sense, she was really a second mother. She gave him life. So that's a nice story about the birth of the Chida. Now, as you can imagine, already when in childhood he was acknowledged as a genius. We do not speak about people that were not acknowledged as geniuses in their childhood. Otherwise, we will not speak about them 200 years later. So obviously, he was a genius. He was bright, and he wrote a sefer Chidushim on tractate Horayot, which is, it's an I shouldn't say that, but in like an exotic tractate. That's not something that you are teaching usually in the young ages. That's something that it's more difficult. It's not practical. So usually you teach things that are much more practical and much more accessible in the young age. Now he wrote a sefer chidushim to this tractate at the age of 17, and as we do here many times, I will send each one of us to rethink about what he was doing in the age of 17, and not writing, at least for me, not writing a sefer chidushim on Masechet Horayot. So in the haskama his father gave him to this book, the book was not published, was not printed when he was 17. As happened back then, you couldn't just send your sefer to the printer with a button. So you had to go to Livorno. There was no printing machine, no printing press in Israel. So you had to go to Livorno. That was, you don't have to go to Livorno. You could also go to Amsterdam. But it was easier to go to Livorno, Italy, in order to print. It would take him some time till he would reach there. But the book was written when he was 17, and he had askama, askama is like a blessing letter in the beginning, from his father. And his father writes in the Haskama. Now, if you want, you can say that the father is unreliable. But you know what? We can, I think, believe what he writes here. He says that's in source bet. Im ילד שעשועים. So my son is a ילד שעשועים, is a boy of amazement. אין מוקדם ומאוחר בתורה. So that's all of this. Now, we have to go, in order to really read all the passages you are going to read today, we have to understand or to get used to the Sephardic 18th century style of writing, which is very Baroque. I mean, it's flowery. Many expressions. Some would say heavy-handed a little. So almost every sentence here is like a phrase from somewhere else, taken and refigured into what the writer is trying to convey. So it is not an easy read. but for people that are able to recognize the source of the different phrases and appreciate the artwork of quoting all of these different quotes and making it into one beautiful paragraph, then it's very artistic. Okay, so let's try to do. I mean, there is no real way to translate that because you cannot translate the quality of the quotes. You cannot translate the context. But we can enjoy at least the ring. So he says, "En mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah." There is no early or late in the Torah. What he means to say is that sometimes very young kids can achieve what others needs to be adult in order to achieve. En mukdam ve'meuchar b'Torah. There is no early or late. כבן שש, כבן שבע, ותחל רוח השם לפעמו. Already when he was 6 or 7 years old, the Spirit of God began to enlighten him. הכיר את בורו, he knew his creator. I cannot hold myself. So just for 1 second, let's trace each one of these phrases just that you would understand the artwork here. So עם ילד שעשועים is a quote from the Tanakh about Ephraim. We know it from the Tefillah of Rosh Hashanah, עם ילד שעשועים הוא. אין מוקדם ומאוחר בתורה, that's a rule in Chazal regarding the Torah, that sometimes the Torah would write something that happened later, and you write it earlier, or vice versa. כבן שש, כבן שבע, that's a Talmudic phrase about the age of a child. When do you need to begin to teach him Torah? ותחל רוח השם לפעמו, that's again a quote from a pasuk that's about Shimshon, that the Holy Spirit, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, began to give him strength. הכיר את בוראו, that's a midrash regarding Abraham Avinu, who knew his creator at the age of 3. So you see how he is, that's beautiful. It's really beautiful, but not an easy read. ויקר יוסף בידיעת בית רבו. So the name of the child is Yosef, Chaim, David, Azulai. So Yosef knew the house of his rabbi, ולא ימוש מרחובה, and he never left the street where his rabbi was teaching. ויית, it should be ויית, not ויש, that's a mistake here. ויית שכמו לסבול. And that's a pasuk from the bracha to Issachar, right? That is a chamor garem, vayet shichmo lisbol, and he brings his back, his shoulder, in order to carry. Here, in order to carry the Torah. Baki be'ataya, yoshev ohalim bet midrasho shel Shem. That's from our Parshat HaShavua, bet midrasho shel Shem. According to the midrash, that is where Yaakov Avinu was sitting for 14 years after leaving his family before reaching Haran. So he says, the father says, my son also sat in the Bet Midrash of Shem Va'ever. Now, who is the Bet Midrash of Shem Va'ever? He says, that is Mar Gisi. That is my brother-in-law. So, as I said, it's a very important and respectful family. So the child was learning by his uncle. That is the brother-in-law of his father, the Rav HaMechaber, the author of the Sefer Nechpa Bekesef. The name is Rabbi Yonah Navon. He is connected to the author of another very famous book, Machne Ephraim. That is Rabbi Ephraim Navon. And if I understand correctly, they are all connected to the man who was the president of Medinat Israel, Ephraim Navon. Yitzhak Navon. Thank you. נכנס ובא, לן בסוד קדושים רבה, בן פורת יוסף. So beautiful. So what we can gather from here is A, that he was a very successful and well-learned child. Again, not a big surprise. And that he learned by his uncle. And as a matter of fact, we have tshuvot. Now, we have, from his youth, we have 7 drashot, sermons, that we know that he gave before bar mitzvah. And I don't mean 7 drashot in the same Shabbat of bar mitzvah. So in the years before becoming bar mitzvah, we have 7 drashot. We also have, from the age of 13, we have a halachic responsa that he wrote. Now, it's not a halachic responsa in the sense that someone from the community asked this child the question and he wrote him a tshuva. That was not to happen. But the way that education, Torah education, was being done, it's a very interesting way. the rabbi, his rabbi was a big Rosh Yeshiva, a very important rabbi, and he would be asked halachic questions. Now, he would give these questions to his young student to write their tshuvot, and then he would inspect and criticize their tshuvot, and they would sit together and write until they would reach the tshuva as the Rosh Yeshiva would see fit. Now, the first tshuva that we have from the Chida is really from the age of 13. It was not printed in any one of his sefarim because he got some really strong critique from his rabbi, so I guess that he didn't feel that the tshuva was proper to be printed. But we found the manuscript, and it's a tshuva about a child that is 13 years old, and he is a firstborn, he's a bechor, but he's a very weak child. Should he fast on ta'anit bechorot before Pesach? And he wrote a tshuva, and we have the tshuva, and on the marginilia, margins, we have the ha'arot, right, the comments of his rabbi. And the rabbi says, here you are not correct, here you should do better, but overall it's a good tshuva, again, much better than what I can write in the age of 13, but he didn't want to publish it. The first published tshuva in one of his responsa, he has, I think, 5 or 6 books of responsa, and the first one is from the age of 15. So in the age of 15, he was already writing tshuva that he thought was proper to be printed. I brought it here in source Gimel. I'm not going to read it because it's just too long. It will take us too much time. It's I think the rabbi made up the question, because I will tell you the question and you tell me what you think. So the question is about a man that has a chicken, and the chicken sit on eggs. Now the chicken has its own 10 eggs, which is hatches. What is the name? Not hatches. It's sitting on them. What is the word? Dogeret, that's the Hebrew word. Incubating. Okay. So the chicken is incubating its 10 eggs. Now comes the friend, let's call the owner of the chicken, and the 10 eggs is Reuven. Then comes Shimon, and he is bringing his own 5 eggs, but each chicken died. So without Reuven knowing, he stuffs his 5 eggs beneath the incubating chicken of Reuven. It's that's why it seems to me a little far-fetched. But I to be honest, I never, I never handled chickens. Maybe they're going from egg to egg. I really don't know. Now all 15 eggs, Baruch Hashem, hatched, and now we have 15 young chicks. And Shimon comes and says, 5 of them are mine. And Reuven says, I'm willing to give you back 5 eggs, but the making of the eggs into a chick was done by me. So I'll give you back 5 eggs, but the young chicks are mine. That was the question that the rabbi gave the Chida, and he wrote 10 pages. It's very long tshuva. I didn't read the whole thing. It begins with about half of a page of apologies about how small he is and how does he dare to answer a question, but his rabbi demanded that he would answer, etc., 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 etc. Very humble, very apologetic. And then he finished with the conclusion that it depends. Obviously, it depends. Now, if Reuven saw Shimon putting there the eggs, then he says, if Reuven saw the eggs being put, then and Shimon knew that Reuven sees him, then it's counterintuitive. Then we can assume that really Shimon let go of the eggs because he knew that Reuven is seeing him putting the eggs there, and it's like a gift. And then everything belongs to Reuven. However, if Reuven admits that he didn't know even that his chicken is sitting on 5 eggs that are not his, then everything, all the 5 chicks would belong to Shimon. And he says about this, I read the pasuk, Shalach teshalech et ha'em ve'et habanim tikach lach. That's the pasuk about Shiluach HaKan. So, and then Shimon would have the chicks, And he says everything that they wrote is not halacha lemaise, meaning we should not count on me. It's lepilpul. It's in order to sharpen the mind. That's my words. I am a worm and not a man. Tolat velo ish. ודוד, I am David, הוא הקטן בדעה, I am small in mind, ובינה and in understanding, עבדו ותלמידו, I am your servant and your student, אסקופה נדרסת. I don't know how to translate אסקופה נדרסת. אסקופה is the doorpost that people always step on. So nidreset is being stepped over. So he says, I am like the doorpost that everyone is stepping over me. It's a humbling language. All right? דורסים אותו לגנאי. It's again, דורשים לגנאי, or לשבח, is a nice Hebrew phrase that you can דורש, you can homiletically say about someone, let's say about נוח. יש דורשים אותו לגנאי, ויש דורשים אותו לשבח. So Noach, some explain his actions to the best, and some see his actions unfavorably. So he says about himself, I am being nidras, I'm being stepped over, and now that's a game of words. He says, instead of nidrash lignai, being explained unfavorably, he says, I am nidras lignai. I'm stepped over in a bad way. Now, again, I'm not sure why he has to so much emphasize his... Anyhow, that is his conclusion, and he felt sure enough in it. It was printed, as I said, in one of his responses many, many years later. But the answer is from when he was 15. Okay, so that is our first, we may say, act. So he is a young man. In about 15 years of old, when he was 15, he was married to a certain girl named Rachel. A certain girl named Rachel, which was also from a very important family, and which he also loved very much. Now, that's not something that usually said about our rabbis, not because I think that they didn't love their wives, but because they do not speak about it. The Chida, Rabbi Yosef Chaim David Azulai, wrote a diary. Now, it was not a complete diary of all of his life. It was like a travel log, in which there were entries for almost every and each day of his travels. And as we will see, he traveled for very long years. So I don't know if much of his life, but a very large portion of his life is covered in his diary. It's an extremely interesting diary, as it is covers, he writes every day almost about his experiences. Some of them are very mundane. So you'd excuse me for what I'm going to tell now, but he wrote it down, so I cannot hold myself. For example, he writes about a certain time that they were traveling, and again, you'd excuse me, but he had to relieve himself. So he asked the wagon to stop, right? And he went down, and he looked for a place that would be private, and he saw a fence, a wall. So he said, if I would jump to the other side, I would be not in the public eye. Unfortunately, he didn't know that, so he just jumped to the other side. The other side, there was a cesspool. Yes, and they had, I mean, you can understand, it's a very respectful rabbi. He had to be saved from there. And he was beginning to shout, and the Baal Agala, the driver, had to come there and pull him out. And so, but he writes it in the diary. He writes in the diary, and it's very nice. He says, "V'kol she'oseh Hashem letova." He says, "I believe that everything God means is for the good." It's beautiful. It's beautiful. So that's the diary. Now, obviously, what I just said, it's just in order to that's a picanteria, right? But he writes about, we'll speak, Be'ezrat Hashem, he writes about his experience in Paris. He saw that, what was the name of the last king? The one that was beheaded? Louis the 16th? 16. So he saw him before being beheaded. If you remember the years, it's a very short while before. He writes about, he visited the zoo in London. He writes about the zoo in London, and many, many very interesting descriptions that he has in this diary. And I would speak more about that as we would begin his journeys, but I'm now skipping many, many years, and that's in source Daled, to the 22 of Adar, the 7th day of Parshat Kitisa, and letters come in Shabbat. Now, in Shabbat, you do not open the letters that are coming, so you open them on Motzi Shabbos. So you can see that's in source Dalet. אחר הבדלה, הלכתי לחדרי ופתחתים. So after the הבדלה, I went to my rooms, and I opened the letters that were for me. וראיתי שבעוונותיי הרבים, I saw that in my many sins, נאמרה פקידה באישה אשת נעורים. I saw that I lost my wife. She was, he says, אשת נעורים, my wife of youth. החסידה, בעלת שכל. Says she was a pious woman. She was בעלת שכל. That's such an interesting thing, right, to say. She was a בעלת שכל. She had a mind. אישה יראת השם. She was a fearing God woman. בעלת צדקות. She was בעלת צדקות. I don't have to, charity. הצנועה, modest. מחמד עיני. She was the treasure of my eye. נווט ביתי, מרת רחל נשמתה עדן. So, you know, nowadays we have tzaddikim that would not write the name of the wife of. The Chida thought that he should write about his wife in his travelogue. And he says, Marat Rachel Nishmata Eden, Ve'olam chashach be'adi. The world became black for me. And then he says, that's amazing. He says, and I immediately understood that I cannot tell the people around me that I became widowed because they would force me to remarry. And he didn't want, in this stage, to remarry. He wanted to be able to mourn for his wife. So he didn't tell anyone that his wife passed away. Now, we speak about Kaf Sivan, Taf Kuf Lamed Gimel. So the Taf Kuf Lamed Gimel is 1773. 1773. So that was after they were married. Let's try to do the math quickly. If they were married when he was 15, he was born in 1724. So let's say that they were married in 1740. So they were married for 34 years, right? If I might, more or less, right? That's my calculation. So for 34 years, and he says he went to the shul and cried there alone for an hour, and he didn't need to sit Shiva because till the letter came to him, it was more than a month after the passing. And if you are being notified more than a month after the passing, you sit only for 1 hour and that's it. So he didn't have to sit Shiva. And he says, I became sick. החליתי משמועה רעה זו. I became sick. And every night he would now wake up in midnight and he would take off his shoes and sit like a shiva, a secret shiva for his wife. And he says, he continues, says, והייתי צר וסופד על אבדת מרגלית כזאת. I was so sad and I was eulogizing for losing such a diamond. אבדת מרגלית זו, שכמעט הייתה יחידה בדור. He says, there was no one like her in the generation. לפי המשוער בדעתי, he says, at least according to my opinion. לפי המשוער בדעתי, מחוכמה, מכבוד, so she was smart, she was honored, שכל עצום ונורא, such a bright mind, וחן, ויופי, she was beautiful, וצניעות גדול, אשר לא ישועה, she was modest beyond belief, ונקיות עצום, she was pure, I guess, באופן שהייתי שר וזעף, I became angry, and again, he cannot share it with anyone. So you can only guess. It's boiling within him. וזה גרם לי שהוחלטתי בחוליה שחורה. He says, I became depressed. חוליה שחורה, the black disease. It means I became depressed. שלא הייתי יכול להשיח. I couldn't speak. Because I couldn't speak about that. And I didn't want to speak about anything else. ולא האמנתי להגיד לשום אדם, והייתי ימים רבים בצער זה, etc. So for many days he said, I was depressed. I couldn't speak.
So I don't know what happened to him. Like what actually happened?
We don't have. If he knew, it was not written. But you have to understand that back then, I think we spoke about it. The health of women many times was not very strong because of the giving births, and medication was not good to anyone. and women became weak after giving many births, and then they passed away in an earlier age than men. That was just 6, I think, which is not maybe so much, but again, for them, yeah. See, let's say that she was 15 when they around, right? So around 15. Well, for them it was not young. For them it was not young. So again, that's I skipped many years ahead, but just to see the type of relationship, and so interesting that we have a window into his relationship with his wife. Okay, now he learned Kabbalah also by Rav Shalom Sharabi, about whom we spoke a few weeks ago. Remember, that's the Yemenite Mekubal. And it's very interesting. He learned there, and he knows Kabbalah back and forth. He's very good at that. But he has no, I apologize for saying that. I hope that you would excuse me. He has no, but he wrote that more or less the same in his writings. He knew Kabbalah, but he didn't have the neshama of a Mekubal. So he had a great knowledge, and he wrote books. He wrote books about everything under the sun. But so he wrote books about Kabbalah and Zohar and explanation to the Zohar. But he was not a, again, I apologize for using these terms, but just for us to understand, he was not a mystic in his inner core. So he knew Kabbalah. So according to the story, the Rav Shalom Sharabi would teach, but would not look him in the eye while he was teaching. And once the Chida gathered the courage and asked him, why don't you look at me? What did I sin that you don't look at me when you teach Kabbalah? And Rav Sharabi told him, that in so say, אמר לו, אני יודע שאין בידך לעולם הזה ללמוד דרך האמת. I know that you didn't come to this world in order to learn the way of truth, which is another term for Kabbalah. So it's, you are not taken from this type of material, I guess. You are not made from this cloth. יש לך השגה בתחילה ללמוד בדרכים אחרים. You first have to learn in other ways. He says to him, ולבסוף תשיג ללמוד דרך האמת. In the end, you would reach the truth. But the Chida, so what did the Chida do? He was, there is a trap word. The right word is prophilic, right? Not prolific, prophilic. No, prolific. I would never get it well. So, he was a prolific writer. He wrote more than 50 books that were published, and there are some that are still in manuscript. And an extremely prolific writer, as I said, about almost everything under the sun. But he had a born sense to history and bibliography, and just, I mean, for example, I'll give you one simple example. As a very young, again, at the age of 16, 17, 18, something like that, he wrote a very short book, almost a pamphlet, called, I think, Ha'alem Davar, things that are hidden. And in which he says, for example, I took notice that the Perush that is usually attributed to Rashi on Divrei Hayamim is not really his. Why? Because they have this proof and that proof and the other proof. Now, what type of proof does he have? He had an eye. Now, he didn't learn in university, right? He just had a natural eye to see inconsistencies in styles of writing, and to remember that in a certain place someone wrote that he saw in a Perush of Rav Saadia Gaon a certain thing, and then he would find it in the Perush of Divrei Hayamim. So here I prove that this Perush is not from Rashi, but from a student of Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon. So he was very unique in this talent. Usually, when you see rabbis writing about history, they do what I do, meaning they're just repeating the stories that they read. That's basically. But he had this natural talent of being a historian, to really try to, how do you say, להצליב, Cross-reference, thank you. To cross-reference different sources and to say, no, this is really a mistake and this is the real thing. Now, also, throughout his life, he kept a diary of his journeys. He also kept, it was like a card system for books. And every books that he came across, he had an entry. I don't know if it was cards or if it was a notebook, but it was like a system. And it was like an open system. So one day he would meet a sefer. So he would write everything that he can see about the sefer. And then he would see a manuscript of the sefer in some other library. So he'd reopen the notebook and again write what he learned. Now, they say that he covered 90-something% of the Hebrew books in his time, which is just unbelieved achievement. As again, I know that I said that we would speak about his journeys, and we are already 40 minutes into the shiur, and I didn't begin even speaking about his journeys, which made him famous. But during these journeys, every time he would reach a city, he would ask to see the local library. And he would go into the National Library in Paris of French, and he looked for Hebrew manuscripts, and he found some very interesting ones, and in other places, and private collections, and he would look for all the manuscripts that he can find, and then he would note, and because it's such photographic memory is not doing justice to his memory, he had an encyclopedic memory. So he would write, I now saw the manuscript of a certain book of the Smug, and they noted that in the fourth chapter, there is a difference from the printed edition, and now I can trace that this manuscript was written, was copied from that manuscript. So he created a whole network of bibliography almost from zero. His notebooks were later printed. Now, he printed them in different occasions because it was like an open database that he would update. So he printed it 4 or 5 times, but it became extremely confused, extremely complicated to find anything there because you would have to look through the different editions and try to guess where you should look for. And after his death, it was reprinted, it was re-edited, and now it's called Shem Agdolim. That's the famous book of the Chida, Shem Agdolim. It was ordered not by him, but after his death, as I said, it was printed in his life, but in a very unorderly fashion because of the reprintings. So after his life, that was like the final edition, and there are 2 volumes. One is according to the alphabet of Sfarim, of the books, and the other is according to the Sofrim, the authors. So you can read about the book or you can read about the writer, and that is used to this day. His work is extremely important for many Sfarim. He saw some manuscripts that were later lost. So he's the only source of information about them. An extremely important sefer, the Shem Agdolim. Okay, so that's the type of a many words. That's a part of just writing about, as I said, everything under the sun. I just brought to here, just to you to see, that is called Chumash Chida. So what they did here, he didn't write Chumash Chida. He wrote many books. What they did was to collect from all the different writings on each and every pasuk, what in any book he written about this pasuk. So this Chumash Chida, it's called Bereshit Bet. It's the 2nd volume of Bereshit. And that's from Toldot to Vayechi. So it's basically about 10 volumes of Chumash Chida. As you can see, many different commentaries of different ways. Some of them are pshat, some of them are sermon or drash, some of them are Kabbalah, some of them are Chida. So many different ways of looking on every pasuk, an extremely interesting sefer. By the way, this sefer, that's the biography of the Chida. It was written by Meir Benayahu, who was the son of Rabbi Yitzchak Nissim, one of the first chief rabbis of Medinat Israel, and he has a very interesting connection to the story of the Chida, about which we would speak, Im Yirtzeh Hashem, I hope in the next 10 minutes, which we are left with. And now, Baruch Hashem, at the age of 29, is a great scholar, and he is asked by the community of Hebron to go and become a shliach in Chutz La'aretz. Now, one of the first things I understood when I went to Toronto for our shlichut, never call yourself a meshulach, only a shaliach.
Yes.
So the Chida was a meshulach. And he went to collect money for the Jewish settlement in Yerushalayim and in Hebron. It was a completely, what can we say? It was done out of real chesed. Because for him, the easiest way was just to sit in Yerushalayim, sit in Hebron, learn Torah, write his books. Why does he need to humiliate himself? Going from door to door and basically asking for money. And he did it out of chesed. But more than that, he did it also because he believed that you should connect the Jewish people in the diaspora to the Jewish settlement in Eretz Israel. And by that, he was not a Zionist. That's not the area that we speak here about, the area that we speak about. But he saw the importance of connecting the Jews together, and the connector should be Eretz Israel. And in some of his responses, he's arguing, people are arguing, why should we give you money? We have our own poor people, the poor people of your city should take precedence over sending the money overseas to Eretz Israel. And he says to them, you know what? If it was a question of tzedakah, you were right. But it's not a question of tzedakah. It's a question of a mitzvah that you have to support the settlement in Eretz Israel. It's a very interesting view. So he went there, and he was not like your regular schnorrer. But what he was trying to present is, I am giving you an opportunity to participate and to take part in the mitzvah of Eretz Israel. For good measure, he also added that the Jews in Eretz Israel are suffering so much, and it's all because of your sins. Because that's what he writes. He says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the atonement, the Mizbeach HaKapara is in Eretz Israel. So the Jews in Eretz Israel, they do not do any sin. They only sit and learn Torah. You are enjoying all the bodily enjoyment and pleasures in Chutz La'aretz. We are suffering because of your sins. The least that you can do is give us some money. Okay, you have to have different pitches, I guess, for different people. So
Appreciate who he was.
So that's a beautiful question. Here we should do a separation between the Sephardi communities and the Ashkenazi communities. That is not a glorified chapter in the history of our people. But the Sephardi communities were almost immediately able to recognize who he was, and they gave him great respect and also great sums of money, and he was very happy. When he reached the Ashkenazi communities in Europe, he was just a skupa nidreset, we said earlier. They stepped over doorpost, doormat again and again. And he would come to a city and they would treat him like nothing. And meaning they didn't respect him. They didn't believe him even that he was a real meshulach for the Jewish settlement, because they didn't know the Sephardic rabbis that were signed on his papers. So all of this story sounds very familiar, right? Very familiar. So we would go and they would give him, 1 penny just to be Yotzei Yedei Chova and throw him away. There was one city, I brought some of the stories here in source chet. I wouldn't read it now inside because of we have no time. He says he came to a certain place at Erev Rosh Chodesh. And he woke up in the morning and he wanted to go with the Balabai to the shul. It's a Rosh Chodesh, right? You need to daven in shul. There is Hallel, there is Kriyat Torah. The Balabai was already finishing his tefillah, he says, in the corner of the house. And the Balabai told him, you need now to go out. I have a goy coming in. I don't want to see you. You are looking very strange. You have your clothes of the Sephardi clothes. So you have to go out. And the Chida says, but I want to daven in the shul. He says, no davening in shul for you. And he says, what about Nedava? What about the money I came for? No, I'm not going to give you any money. Okay, so how I'm supposed to leave? Meaning the house was not in the city, it was in some village. So how am I supposed to leave? So the guy says to him, the garbage cart is leaving now, so you can take a ride. Now, the Chida said, it is not my honor. For my honor, I would go in the garbage cart, but it is not Eretz Israel honor that you would send the shliach from Eretz Israel on the garbage wagon. So he refused to go on the garbage wagon. He demanded that he would be given, a special taxi. The final outcome, as you can guess, is that he walked by foot outside of there. But that is just one example of what he had to suffer on the ends of, I guess, of some of our own forefathers. But you can also understand them. Who knows how many Meshulachim, again, and we know how it works, how many Meshulachim came there and claimed that they are from Eretz Israel, and they are big Rabbanim, and they are who knows what, and not just another one coming with funny clothes. So it was very sad for him. Now, there were some rabbis, one of the most famous one was the Pnei Yehoshua, that recognized, Ashkenazi rabbis that recognized his greatness, and they gave him some askamot. But the Ashkenazim were also not very respectful of their own rabbis' askamot. And he was able almost to collect no money, and he had to pay for the traveling cost himself. So in the end, it seemed that he lost more money in his operation in Ashkenaz than he earned. So I apologize for this not very part of our story. But he had very interesting experiences. As I said, he visited the zoo in London, and he writes about the beautiful animals that he saw there. And he met in Paris, there was some Sephardi community, so there was someone there that did respect him a little, and he took him to see the king. As I said, the last king of Louis XVI in Paris. And when Louis saw him, Louis went by. And Louis saw him, and again, he was dressed like an Ottoman man. So he asked him, from where are you an ambassador? And he said, I'm not an ambassador. I came here only for curiosity. Okay, that was the answer. And happily, the king didn't take his head off. And that was the story. And again, everywhere he went, he was looking for manuscripts. So even if he was not able to gain money, at least he was able to trace all the different Sepharim in the area. Now, he came back to Eretz Israel. 6 years took this journey. His wife stayed at home. She was still alive in this time. He's coming back. In Eretz Israel, there is a very big machloket because, the Ashkenazi have their own troubles, but the Sephardic also have their own troubles. And the Sephardim were very hierarchical. The Ashkenazim, that is a feature of the Ashkenazi culture, that every mamzer was a king. Right? So everyone just did what he wanted. And every small rabbi was the king of his community, and that was the end of it. There was almost no organization that was able to control and to enforce any type of policy. Now, it has its benefits, it has its disadvantages. In Spain, and also after the expulsion, they were very hierarchical. So there was like the big man who sat in Constantinople, nowadays Istanbul, Constantinople, and he controlled everything, including Eretz Israel. But if there was a fight, it could sometimes be very, very, very ugly. And that was happened, and they wanted the Chida to intervene. He didn't want to intervene because he estimated that it would do no good. In the end, he found himself in Egypt being like type of a chief rabbi there. So that was his way to avoid the machloket. I'm skipping. It's very interesting. Everything is very interesting. But for our purposes, in 1772, he is doing another journey. This time, almost exclusively to Sephardi communities. He didn't go to Ashkenazi communities anymore, and that was, I guess he learned his lesson. But he was much more respectful now, because many of his books were now printed and published, and he was well known, and everywhere he came, he was accepted with honor. He said he was in Tunisia. And he says that he began to feel that something strange is happening behind him. And every time he would look, there was no one there. But someone's like, tailing him. And he understood at a certain point that pregnant women would go after him and take he had a long robe, take his robe and kiss it. And that was considered like a sgula for having a good child. So he says, I didn't know what to do with it. He says, I was walking in the street and women were like jumping in and taking hold of my robe. Yeah. So it's
The child told everyone,
he had an interesting life. He had a really interesting life. Now, this was a journey that took him 200 years. So he went on 1772, but he never returned to Eretz Israel. He remained in Livorno, Italy, to print his Sefarim. And he was remarried, by the way, to another woman called Rachel, which I don't know what to make out of it, but another woman called Rachel. And they had another 2 boys from her. I mean, he was old, but she was young. And he just stayed there in Livorno. We know from his diaries that he did want to make an aliyah, but every time there was some obstacle, and it seems that he loved being in Livorno because of the books. Right? He was a bibliophile, how do you say? A bibliophile, right? So he was addicted to books. And Livorno was the central, that and Amsterdam were the central place for Jewish books. And he just, I guess he couldn't leave. He just couldn't live, and he was printing dozens of Sefarim. And they wanted to make him the chief rabbi. He refused, but everyone knew that he is the big name in all of Italy. Another very important book that he wrote is called the Birkei Yosef, which is commentary on the 4 parts of the Shulchan Aruch. Extremely important. I will almost conclude, by a quote from Rav Yosef. Many years later, right? He's a contemporary. Many years later, Rav Yosef is writing about the question of Isur of fish in milk. We, the Ashkenazim, are unaware that such a thing exists. But the Sephardim, as there is an Isur of fish and meat, they also have an Isur of fish and milk. So no tuna pizza for you, Sephardic man. And the Rav Yosef is writing about this issue. And while discussing it, he says, I like the words of our Geon Uzeinu, of our pride and strong force, the Chida, because he's like one of the early commentators. And he says, just in paraphrasing what they said about the Rambam, Mi Moshe ad Moshe lo kam ke Moshe, from Moshe Rabbeinu to Moshe ben Maimon, there was no one like Moshe. So I say, from Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, to Yosef, to the Chida, Rabbi Yosef Chaim David Azulai, there was no one like Yosef. So he's being compared to the Shulchan Aruch. And if anyone knows here about what the Rav Yosef feels about the Shulchan Aruch, about Rabbi Yosef Karo, that is like the highest level, the highest compliment that you can get from Rav Yosef. He says, we accepted upon them ourselves the instructions of the Chida, and that's why he says we can be lenient sometimes. Obviously, we do not learn now the halacha of fish and milk, but because the Chida thought that we can be lenient, he says we can rely on him on certain areas. And he says, but that's very important to see that he is being understood as one of the most prominent poskim for Sephardic Jewry, the Chida. So that's from his book, the Birkei Yosef. Now, his journey concluded 200 years later. Why? He died and was buried in Livorno. But in the 50s, when Rav Yitzchak Nessim, the father of the author of this biography, was the Rav Rashi, then he decided that he wants to rebury the Chida here in Yerushalayim. And it was a very long and complicated process, but in the end, the authorities in Italy agreed. Part of that was because when the fascists ruled Italy, they destroyed the old cemetery where the Chida was buried in Livorno. Now, they did move the bones, but what it meant was that he anyway was not in his original burial, and he was in a not so respectful place now. So they decided to make an aliyah to his bones, because he did want to make an aliyah. So 200 years after his death, was reburied. You can visit his, if you want, you can visit his grave. It's in the entrance to Har HaMenuchot. Now, they wanted to bury him in the Har HaZeitim, but if you remember in the 50s, they wrote to Har HaZeitim, and the Har HaZeitim itself was not in our control. So they were not able to bury him in Har HaZeitim. He's buried in the entrance to Har HaMenuchot. There's a very nice grave there, ohel, as we say. And I guess that because the family felt so connected to him, that's why his son, Meir Bneiyahu, wrote this wonderful biography of the Chida. So that's a journey that did conclude, and the Chida did find itself in the end in Eretz Israel. So again, we spoke here today about a very wide personality with many areas of expertise and interest, and someone that connected back, we may say, the Jewish world to Eretz Israel in his actions, and it's only befitting, I think, that he would also be reburied here in Eretz Israel. Thank you so much, and I do hope next week, Be'ezrat Hashem, Rabbi Chaim of Volozhin. Be'ezrat Hashem. Be neder.